Welcome to the Nomad Futurist Podcast, where ideas shape the future and visionaries redefine what's possible. Join us as we dive deep into the evolution of technology, society, and human potential, spotlighting the voices driving change and reimagining our world. Connect with us and join us at media.nomadfuturist.org. The future is a story we write together. Let's kick it off. Here are your hosts, Phil and Nabeel. Hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host, Nabeel Mahmood from Kailua Kona, Hawaii.
This is your co-host, Phillip Koblence from Montclair, New Jersey.
And I'm the guest. I'm Rich Miller, and I am in Lawrenceville, New Jersey today.
Brilliant. Is that where you live, Rich?
Yes, we are right in central New Jersey between Princeton and Trenton, a really lovely part of the state, and we've called it home for a bunch of years now.
Well, now I get it why they only have one time zone, Phil, and that's the Eastern time zone.
Oh,
Journalism and data centers are back.
The only one that matters. It's where Phil and Rich Miller live. That's
Exactly.
the only one that matters.
Very excited to have you on this podcast. It's been way past due. Before we get started, could you share at a very high level with our audience, who is Rich Miller and what does Rich Miller do?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So I'm a journalist who has been tracking the data center industry as my sort of full-time gig for about 24 years now. Before that, I worked for about 20 years in daily and weekly newspaper journalism here in New Jersey. So I've been doing journalism of some form really since I got started. I started out as a sports writer, and that's kind of where the journey began. But, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So I'm assuming you ended up picking up journalism in college.
Yeah, so actually it extends back to high school was my first interest in journalism, which actually happened because my older sister was the editor of the high school newspaper. And she and her friends manned most of the posts, but she really didn't know anything at all about sports. And I was a sports fan. And she's like, Rich, why don't you write about sports? And so I became kind of the sports desk for my high school newspaper. It just came out monthly, but it was my first taste of writing in that way. And so then when I got to Rutgers, where I went to school, I checked out the student newspaper there, the Daily Targum, and just fell in love with everything about reporting, covering sports on deadline. I think what was one of the best training exercises you could have for a career in journalism. You really learned everything that you need to know to succeed. And both there and in my early jobs, I worked at a chain of weekly newspapers in New Jersey and in Princeton, the Princeton Packet Group, covering high school sports mostly. And so that's really kind of how I got my start. I was drafted by a family member to fill in a gap in the lineup, and the rest is kind of history.
Brilliant.
Could you be more in New Jersey than that? I mean, the Rutgers paper, the Trenton, whatever. I mean, every town in Jersey has had the journalism of Rich Miller. I think there's a governorship in taking for you. I've never seen it.
I heard he might be retiring.
The governor's job. I haven't seen the governor's job, and I'm not interested.
Not interested. All right. Rich Miller has bowed out of the governorship, Mr. Murphy.
He's only going for the office now as in the White House. All right. So, Rich, besides your sister, was there any other influence in you from your parents, from others in your family that helped drive your writing?
Well, my mother was a librarian and just loved the written word. And she taught me to read before I even got to kindergarten. And so I've always had this tremendous love of reading and really learning. I was that nerd who would sit there with the encyclopedias each afternoon after school in front of the bookcase with the World Book, pouring myself into learning about whatever was my passion for that week. And everyday learning has really become a part of who I am and what I do. And that's true for my whole family. I come from sort of a family of high achievers. My older sister's a professor of medieval history, an older brother who's an executive in information security, my sister who's a nurse anesthetist, got a lot of folks in healthcare. And so it's always been the notion of always learning. And that's one of the things that I loved about journalism is when you came into the office each day, you never really knew what was going to happen that day. That's sort of the nature of news, is that stuff happens almost every day and you get to tell that story. And for anybody who's been a voracious reader, the whole storytelling component of what we do is a big part of it.
So I see a lot of relationships getting into the technology sector. Before we get into this, however, you mentioned you started writing about sports. Was there a particular sport that you were interested in? Did you play sports? It's just interesting, right? Like that whole transition in writing about sports and from sports to coming into the technology sector. So could you just share that
Sure,
journey?
because there's an interesting story around that. I mean, I loved all kinds of sports. I participated a lot in track and field in high school, so that was sort of my first area of interest. But I loved just about all sports. And in college, you wind up starting in the sort of, we would think of them as second tier beats. You don't go in starting to write about football and basketball. I covered things like lightweight football and crew and women's golf, and you sort of generally work your way up. But obviously, I love football and baseball. I'm a longtime Giants and Yankees fan. I am in the Giants-Yankees paradigm as opposed to the Mets and Jets, which Phil might recognize. But
There's a reason you have hair and I do not. And it's because I fall into the Mets paradigm.
if I had any black hairs left, they'd be gone soon. But writing about sports, as I said, it's tremendous training for many things. You write a lot. You write on deadline. You learn to assemble your thoughts about what the story is going to be, often while the event is still happening, and then think about how you're going to tell the story. And after I got married, at one point, my wife, Colleen, who has also worked with me on some of my data center publications, said to me, so is it always going to be nights and weekends? And in sports, it very much is. And, she was working a day job. And so I began to kind of look around the newsroom for what other kind of opportunities there were. And at the time I was working at a daily newspaper in New Brunswick, and they needed someone to help run the business desk. And that is as close to a 9-to-5 job as exists in the newsroom. And so I went over, and almost right away, I became really interested in business and learning all about that. My first day on the business desk was October 19th, 1987, which was the day that the Dow fell 22%. So I got to jump right into a major story happening on my first day on business.
It was not a lot of boredom in the Rich Miller introduction to the business news.
No, when I came into the news meeting that night, it was,
what was that, Black Friday or Bad Wednesday?
Yeah, it was a really big news day, and it was easy to explain, why that story ought to get a good display on the front page.
I imagine that first week, though, it was not simply 9 to 5.
No, and that's one of the things you learn is you can't put journalism in
Colleen. Sorry, I tried.
She understands the life of a journalist's wife, but that was like the late 80s that I started doing that. And into the early 90s, I was covering broadly the tech sector in New Jersey. It was a lot of pharmaceutical news, a lot of tech. But by the middle of the decade, the internet was really this thing. It was the big story. And that became the story to explain. And, between that and, of course, we have a lot of experts who were at Princeton University. So I wrote about a bunch of things, but it all roads eventually led back to the internet. I wrote a column about technology and became sort of the newsroom technology director. But one of the things we started to see about the internet, which I figured out the first time I used this, was the first time I logged onto America Online, it was a revelation. It was like, oh, this isn't just about reading stuff. This is a publishing medium that immediately took all of the cost out of the equation. That rather than just being able to write stories that would be printed downstairs and a truck would take to, stores around the New Jersey, you could just sit down on your computer, type a story, and have it go out to the world.
On a real-time basis.
Yeah. And that was just wild. I immediately looked at that and saw that sort of unlocking a lot of possibilities. And a lot of folks in the newspaper business were very sort of tied to the tradition of news being something that came out each morning on newsprint at the newsstand or people's driveways. And so I began to get really interested in working on the internet and tried to point the way forward to that. But, the folks at the papers I was working at still thought, well, people make stuff up on the internet, and just didn't see it as being the future in the way that I was kind of already convinced of.
I think the thing that's amazing about it is like coming into it at a time that you came into it, where you kind of straddled the before digital world and you got a front row seat at the disruptive abilities of the internet that transcended verticals. The publishing one is an obvious one, right? You have the ability to reach all of these people in real time as opposed to having to go through traditional channels. But there was the same issue in commerce and retail stores and not embracing e-commerce. If you look at Blockbuster Video versus Netflix and that whole saga, it's incredible to see. One question I have is, if you have had the opportunity to look back at some of the early stories you were writing about the internet, were any of your predictions or the way you saw it, did it end up differently than you thought it would?
It's interesting. A lot of the columns in like the late 1990s that I was writing during the beginnings of the .com era were like, I wrote a lot about MP3s and Napster, and which was disruptive kind of stuff. And on the one hand, I'm trying to explain this to an audience of folks who probably are less accustomed to all of this, don't know as much about it as I did as the tech columnists follow it, which was an interesting entry point into fields of specialized journalism where the folks you're writing about know lots more about the subject matter than you do. But the thing that we were always focused on early on is sort of casting about for the business model. How is this all going to work going forward? Like, for example, the record companies battling Napster, just because they won in court didn't mean that the world wasn't changing, right? And you can't put that back in the bottle. And, although folks try, and the news business is kind of the same way, really struggling with, as the paradigm changes, particularly when Google sorted out the advertising model, the internet was dragging us all into the future really quickly. And it was always an interesting story to see which industries began to be disrupted, how they responded, and what sort of opportunities that created for change and for the changing of the guard, really.
Did you get pushback from your publications about some of the things that you're writing because they didn't? I mean, I don't know what editorial control was like in, late 90s regional paper Jersey, but did you get pushback in that you're like, this is a medium that's going to disrupt the very thing that I'm writing in right now, and I'm going to write about how this business is going to be the buggy whip of 2010?
Yeah, well, I clearly saw all of this coming. And part of my role within the newsroom was both to write about it, but also to say, hey, look, this is changing everything. We can kind of get on board and focus on internet publishing or get steamrolled by it, And things just, as is the case with a lot of industries where they're very used to the traditional way of doing things and pretty comfortable in their market position, change moved very slowly, particularly in the early days. So that was about the time where I began thinking, how would this work if my publication wasn't going to dive full on into the internet? Where would the opportunity come from? And it wound up being somebody who worked in telecom real estate that Colleen met and introduced me to. And he was like, you should stop writing on all that newspaper stuff. And what you should be writing about is carrier hotels and data centers. And I'm like, yeah, who can make a living doing that? And I've spent the next quarter century sorting that out. But, for me, then the jumping off point was this guy named Joe Suppers who worked in.
Everybody knows Joe.
Everybody knows Joe Suppers. So Joe said to me, he says, look, just come walk through a data center with me. Tell me what you think. And you've probably heard lots of people who have this kind of experience, where you walk into the data center and this entire world reveals itself of, the look behind the curtain with the servers and, blinking lights and the raised floors and all of the equipment and the cooling that's blowing out of the raised floor and the cabling. And I'm just looking everywhere at this world, and it made that connection. The light bulb went off over my head between how much I loved using the internet and how everybody I knew was loving using the internet. And I was like, oh my goodness, we're going to need these everywhere.
It's almost like meeting Oz.
Well, it was an interesting experience. So
do you remember which data center that was?
Sure. It was a level 3 data center outside of Princeton in South Brunswick, New Jersey. a very small one, nothing like some of the things you'd see today, but it was just a small window into this world of infrastructure that sits behind the internet and everything that the internet can do for us. So said I should come work for him. We'll publish a website about carrier hotels, and the people who are learning about this will show up.
So journalist, not necessarily by choice, by accident.
Yeah, but I loved it from the get-go. And
if you weren't going to be a journalist, what would you have been? Like, what was your idea, if you even had one, prior to your sister saying, can you write about sports in high school?
Yeah, even when I arrived at Rutgers, I was thinking I was going to be a marine biologist. And freshman biology kind
There's something Seinfeldian about that.
Yeah.
George Costanza, was George Costanza a marine biologist?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, then he worked for the Giants.
No, Yankees. Come on,
right.
you have to rewatch it.
No, but that was what I was thinking initially. But I loved going fishing, and I was fascinated. When I was 16, Jaws came out, and I was like, ooh, I was very interested in that. But that takes a lot of discipline and study that just didn't speak to me the way that going to the college newspaper and writing sports stories did.
So journalists by accident, okay, wanted to be, or you were interested in sports. Technology and data center, again, sort of by an accident, and then being an entrepreneur. I can't even imagine having that conversation with Colleen. I mean, there's never going to be a 9-to-5 job. I've not held to my promise of a 9-to-5 job. I'm writing at odd hours. I'm having these conversations in odd hours, and now I want to be an entrepreneur. I mean,
yeah. So I was very much sort of the accidental entrepreneur, really. I mean, after carrierhotels.com kind of wound down, I was freelancing about different kinds of, web hosting mostly. I did some work with Netcraft, which was an outfit in the UK, which does some really interesting research about the size of the internet and who's using what kind of software. And one day I was very familiar with, some of the properties that had wound up in bankruptcy and had been hard to sell because they were in the wrong place. In the nuclear winter, that was 2003. Phil, you certainly remember that. There were a couple of properties in California, right near Los Angeles Airport in El Segundo, that had been sitting there, were unable to sell. And all of a sudden, in the span of 2 or 3 weeks, both of them went at a surprising price. And I'm like, there's something going on out there. This internet and data center thing isn't dead. And so that's when I started writing, just as you could do. I popped open my computer and started typing a blog post, started Data Center Knowledge, and the rest is kind of history. At that time, business models in internet journalism there really weren't any great models. Everybody was trying new and different things to try and make it work. And so it was just an interesting experiment. But I was just like, well, most of the information about data centers is in these like newsletters and things like that. We'll just keep pumping the news out there, see who shows up, and if any kind of business model comes up around it. But, you find that when you are scrambling for putting a career together, you do what you got to do. I didn't plan on going into business for myself, and suddenly this thing I was doing as kind of a side gig then really became growing.
You're the original influencer.
Yeah, the OG of data.
The original Kim Kardashian of data center world.
Exactly. I mean, I remember clearly in the early 2000s, I mean, we would have these newsletters or we'll have these blog posts, sort of like the Reddits of the day back then, chat groups, so on and so forth. And when you came up with Data Center Knowledge, that kind of ended up being that connective tissue of.
It's like you didn't have to read all that shit because Rich read it. Rich read it and told us what was going on.
Yeah.
And
there were two things that I read. One was Data Center Knowledge, and before Data Center Knowledge, I would read a spoof on Fast Company, which was called Fucked Company.
I remember that.
That was great. It would come out. And we used to have like, oh shit, another one went belly up, right? So we would just basically paste them on the wall and try to chase if like they had any abandoned data center space and if that was, an opportunity. But yeah, I mean, you're the original guy.
Yeah. So you do DCK, Data Center Knowledge, for roughly about 10 or so years. And then
That's about right, yeah.
Yeah, then you started Data Center Frontier. Tell us about that.
I've had sort of 2 cycles through now, the journey of, starting up a publication and taking it from very beginning and bootstrapping all the way through acquisition and then transitioning a new team on, because data center knowledge grew tremendously while we were doing it and really built a dynamic audience. And, I've always been really good, as an entrepreneur, of working with small teams. And what my first love is the writing and reporting and the explanatory journalism. So when things start to reach a size where it's a really big operation and you got to think about, well, do you hire people? Do you partner with somebody? With both DCK and with Data Center Frontier, I was fortunate to work with, I found a guy who could sell ads in the data center space. His name was Kevin Normando. He was a tremendous partner. He'd worked at AOL and IDG. And so he kind of worked the business side and left me to be able to just focus on the writing and reporting and the content. And that worked really well, both data center knowledge. And then we sort of put the band back together at Data Center Frontier to do different kind of stories and different kind of journalism as data center knowledge continued to grow and prosper. So it's been an interesting ride with 2 publications, taking them all the way through the cycle. Data Center Knowledge was bought by iNet Interactive back in 2012. They also posted, they published a web host industry review. They ran Data Center World back then. And then they've gone through a succession of owners. And then Data Center Frontier, we were acquired in 2022 by Endeavor Business Media, which does a lot of different industry verticals and was looking to boost their tech coverage. So then I spent some time working with them, transitioning the publication onto their platform, helping build a team that's
bestowing that Rich Miller credibility, which does not come with any of these acquisitions, because it's exactly right here. It's right here in Lawrenceville.
The thing is, it's been fun to encounter many people in the field who recall reading a lot of early coverage at Data Center Knowledge in particular, because back then that was just when the search engines were getting started. And because I was writing so much about this topic, Google, was very kind to Data Center Knowledge, and that if people went and typed, what's a data center, into Google, they often wound up on our website. So that's been a real blast over the years to get to know so many people because they came and read that. I would show up at conferences and find that a bunch of folks, they're like, hey, I've seen your picture on the
Right.
Yeah.
You became the first data center celebrity.
Well, he's still a celebrity, Phil.
I know, but he was the first one. He's not going anywhere.
Well,
He's
now-
one of the few
now-
people in this industry that remembers me with hair.
I do. And I might have not had completely gray hair then. No, but it's been quite a ride. And over the years, the interesting thing is, as for you guys, I've had a front row seat to see this extraordinary change in the internet, the facilities that run it, and how it's changed society and how it's grown. And to the point where, what's going on today it would have been hard to imagine in the early days of covering the carrier, hotel, and data center industry.
Yeah. You have such a unique perspective, having kind of been there the entire time with a 30,000 foot view. You weren't trapped like we were, like the folks that are running the little data centers. You didn't have the albatross of actually running these operations. So you had this 30,000 foot view. And is there something in that time with all the ebbs and flows, and you went from data center to cloud to repatriation and hybrid, and now AI and IoT and whatever buzzwords Alyssa Miller came up with, no relation, just in case anyone's wondering. Is there something that surprised you about those ebbs and flows? Were you just kind of holding on for the ride and reporting on it? Or did you think that it would take a turn that it didn't follow? Is there a data center laser disc, the thing that you thought was going to take off that never did?
Well, I think there's some trends that have taken a while to take hold. I think first, cloud computing. For a long time, people thought that was just not secure. We're not going to let our people put our stuff into the cloud. The old joke was that there's lots of companies who don't think they're in the cloud, who haven't looked at the credit card receipts for the folks in their company who are all leasing space on Amazon. But cloud was one of those things that built slowly and has sort of become this extraordinary phenomenon. And we've had a few of those come along. Edge computing, I think we're still sorting out exactly what that is and looks like. And there's a lot of different versions of it. But I want to say the one that has been the biggest sort of surprise has been the way that AI has changed things and how quickly everybody kind of like jumped on board and said, hey, this is going to be the future, so we got to build for it. The other thing that I've been tracking a lot over the years is just there have been two interesting trends. One is just the energy efficiency and sustainability piece of it, which has been so important. And I think I was very early on. That was, you kidded about, Rich is going to come in an army or something. That was the one area where I felt I could really try to hold people's feet to the fire and point out the importance of sustainability going forward. And the fact that ultimately there was people outside were going to notice and start putting pressure on the industry to do a better job. And of course, Greenpeace came along, did exactly that. The next thing was in 2014 was the first time I started talking about community impact and the fact that not everybody is going to be thrilled about having a data center next door to them, and that the industry needs to be able to explain itself, understand community resistance and why it happens, and be able to respond to it. And that was yet another thing where it was like, hey, listen, eventually I wrote any number of stories saying, hey, this is going to be a problem. We have to think about how we're going to deal with this. And it's really only the last couple of years where I think folks have kind of gotten religion a little bit about that and understood how important working with communities and community impact is.
Yeah, ironically, it took them, like folks saying no to their data center developments in order to let them realize that people might not be as big of fans for these empty buildings that are theoretically taking all of the resources in a particular community. They're not as great as they think. People should be welcoming them as liberated. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for bringing all these computers and these, diesel fuel bombs into our
But I mean,
roads.
I would just want to express my concern here, right? It's the narrative. I mean, we have done the crappiest job as a sector to promote what we are doing. We have built ugly buildings that look like prisons. We have gone with the pundits that have got zero idea what technology does and what's doing for the society. And all what they look at is the evil or the bad things. I mean, let's look at all the good that it's actually done and continues to do. From a journalist perspective, and as you have sort of like thrown in the towel or whatever you want to call it, not in defeat, but as retiring, what would you want to see in the future? I mean, how do we address these gaps and these silos and these deficits that we have started to create because we don't have a clear understanding of where the future is and or what our narrative should be?
I think there's a couple of things, and these are things that I've been talking about and writing about for a long time. The first is this industry loves secrecy, particularly in the development phase. And it always stunned me as someone who had worked in journalism and gone to public meetings and understood how the local government process works, that companies would come in and with their code name projects and ask public officials to sign non-disclosure agreements that limited what they could share about their work they were doing on behalf of their community. It just always seemed to me that that was a tone-deaf thing that wasn't going to end well. Look, it's easy to be inside this industry and look at the way that things get done and really not see it from the other side. And I think there's just two things that are really important is just being able to communicate and feel that you are part of the community, that the things you do here are going to be important. And I think it's easy when you're building something that is this incredible global machine to not think of it as a business right in this community. When your mission feels like it's to the world, maybe you lose track of that a little bit. That's just sort of one of my theories about this. But there's also the penchant for secrecy has become a real transparency problem. When you talk about sustainability, when you talk about the ways that any business, any large industrial kind of facility impacts the area where it's located, the use of water, whether or not there's any pollution. Data centers have always just had something of an offbeat story as an economic development tool, because it used to always be, well, how many jobs are you creating? And that's an easy measure to look at a business and develop an opinion around whether they're good for a township or not. But also with a lot of employees would come the need to make improvements to the roads, to the schools. Data centers came in with a model where you don't have to improve the road to the schools necessarily, because we might have 25 people working here in this ginormous building, but there will be a ton of investment within that with a correspondingly large impact on the township's tax base, which then allows lots of other things, as you can see in any number of places, particularly Loudoun County, where data centers, Buddy Reiser says that they're pushing nearly $1 billion a year in taxes that the data center industry contributes to the community. So it's really easy to kind of look at that and think that there's not going to be this scrutiny. And of course, that hasn't been the case, for quite some time. And the minute the headlines started to really, that's the thing that I noticed. It's like when all the headlines start to be about data centers as these energy sucking entities, these awful big concrete buildings that are just sucking up all the resources.
Windowless vacuum cleaners of water and power.
Yeah. And as folks who work in the industry, it's easy to understand the positive impact, all the work that happens in the data center and the impact that it does. I mean, which was writ large during the pandemic. I mean, the ability for all of us to be able to conduct our lives online, really, whether it was education, it was, business, all the Zoom meetings, the government services, healthcare, that stuff was able to move online because data centers were there to support that and were able to expand to meet that need. So I think the baseline problem is that folks in the industry, didn't really kind of get for a long time what these buildings and them showing up everywhere, how they were really being received by the community until there was a pretty serious reputational problem already. Right. And so now I think it's taken a long time for the industry to get that. And there's a lot of work to do doing, Nabeel, some of the stuff that you mentioned, just being able to tell the story and help people understand why data centers, what their role is in the world and in the community, why they're an interesting place to work, and
Absolutely.
and how that creates all sorts of opportunity.
It's one of the unintended, I think, impacts of when we started this podcast and ultimately our foundation. What we found, I don't think initially we went into it, thinking we'd do anything other than try to at least provide some base of knowledge for future generations that may want to look at this as a career path. And what we found was a huge amount of interest in kind of learning what our industry is from a community engagement perspective. And in large part, it's because, like you said, our industry was focused on this concept of security through obscurity without the understanding that if you're obscure, then you're inevitably mysterious in not a great way as you're trying to develop and asking for permission to deploy within basically every community on the planet that might not necessarily be as welcoming to a kind of non-traditional use of real estate with the metrics that you described. Well, I want to talk about one thing that I've always loved about you and about your writing is how clear it is, how curious you are about our industry. That curiosity is something that it doesn't matter if it was Data Center Frontier or Data Center Knowledge. When it was a Rich Miller article, it was clear that it was going to be explained in a way that you would explain anything that you're passionate about. So it's plain spoken and you understand it. And when you transact on a business like that, and I think this is true for any founders that transact on a business, whether it doesn't matter the vertical, whether it's a data center business or managed services or making widgets or whatever. But how do you create a scenario where that curiosity permeates the organization? And can you? Is it even possible? I'm not asking you, hopefully, I'm not asking you to throw Data Center Knowledge or Data Center Frontier under the bus saying there's no way they can recreate it. I know Matt, I know those guys seem like legitimately curious, but you had such a unique voice compared to some of the other just kind of bland reporting on the numbers or reporting on specific things. How do you instill that curiosity?
A couple of thoughts on that. First and foremost, I think data center journalism has come a tremendously long way. When you look at all the publications that are out there, and some of the leading publications are staffing up to be able to really do a good job covering everything that's going on out there. And I think it is as I mentioned, I've always been interested in explanatory journalism. When I was on the news beat, working at a newspaper in Trenton, for a while, I was sort of the complexity reporter. When something would come up that's a tricky story that needed some explanation, I would sort of boil that down to a story where somebody who was just picking up the newspaper that morning with their morning coffee could understand why it mattered, the sort of give a shit meter, as my editor at the time called it. And, to me, there are so many facets of the data center, both in terms of the infrastructure that runs it, all the different components, whether it's power, cooling, understanding everything from chips to the servers themselves, to the many streams of demand that you get out there. It is, that whole thing that I talked about learning something new every day. This has been just a learning rich environment because there's so much that's just fascinating. And what I found, which was really fortunate for me, was that people in the data center industry were dying for people to ask them about what they were doing and to understand the importance of all these things that were going on pretty much behind the scenes, and were extremely generous with their time in letting me come, just like you did, Phil, let me come and see your data center and walk through it and get firsthand knowledge and be able to ask a lot of dumb questions. And this was before Explain It Like I'm Five was a thing, but just to distill the significance of what was going on. And the other thing is, because I've always been very careful about getting the details right. And I think that's something that really calls you to make a higher effort to really understand what it is that you're writing about and trying to tell people. One of the things I wrote about back in the day was I wrote religion and values for like 2 years. And one of the things I learned is when you write about people's faith, it's really important that you're kind of the custodian of an experience and that really matters to people. And this is very true in professional fields too. Everyone really cares about what they're doing. And it's always interesting when you're in a field and you see a journalist write about it, and they get it sideways. It's like, oh man, what a missed opportunity. So I always tried to take the time to ask the dumb questions, to make sure I was trying to get my head around all of these advanced technologies and really trying to bring it down to the level where everybody could understand why it mattered to them, because it almost always did.
Absolutely. So, Rich, you certainly had a very interesting background and career, and you've seen the rise and the fall and the rise again of our sector. You briefly mentioned about artificial intelligence and how it's accelerated the growth and the challenges that we have started to run into with sustainability and others. Besides that, I mean, one of the things that when Phil and I started this and over, 4+ years of doing this now, the biggest challenge that we see that's not been manned and or addressed is the human capital deficit that we have started to currently face. And I mean, you're a good example, right? I mean, with the silver tsunami and all of us actually kind of at or close to the retirement age, where do you think we're headed? What do we need to do to make this more of a streamlined opportunity as it is with other verticals, let's just say banking or discrete manufacturing and other sectors that exist? How do we create the level of excitement from your perspective? And you are one of the exceptions in our journey thus far as well. I think you're the first journalist that's been on our platform. And that's a major part of what we are doing, right? I mean, that's a major part of our sector. Someone's actually got to be able to take that narrative and share it and simplify it for the masses. What do you think we need to do as a sector to simplify, address, create excitement, and get people in?
Well, on one level, as you know, it's exactly what you and Phil are doing, is getting people who understand this business and getting them to tell their stories to people who don't know, especially students and people from other industries who may not understand the opportunity that's here. I think there's been progress. You guys have seen it. I know like lately you've connected with a lot of other like-minded groups in the industry to really try and sort of have everybody working in the same direction, because not having enough employees to make things run as they ought, it's a real motivator, right? And I think as the critical worker shortage continues, that the companies will begin investing more in these and have it be more of a front of mind issue. And I think that's part of why you guys are able to collaborate more. And the iMasons obviously have been working on that. We've been seeing outfits like, Salute and Overwatch working to bring members of the military and get them involved and position data centers as a next career. I actually saw, there's a little bit of a really hopeful sign was a couple of months ago that the Wall Street Journal ran a story that sort of said, hey, here's this amazing industry where without like advanced degrees, you can get right into something that's growing like crazy and start making good money with training that most people it's accessible to. And, I hadn't really seen a lot of stories like that out there. And so I think the awareness is starting to grow as folks really come to realize how important it is that. So it's not just, you two trying to, point to the future and drag the industry behind.
If it has to be us two, it will be us two. But it is nice to see that other folks, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are talking about digital infrastructure on Squawk Box, on CNBC. The business reporters are talking
Absolutely.
about, one of the few elements of commercialized real estate that is growing is digital infrastructure real estate, with a glut of commercial real estate and industrial, et cetera. So all of those things are likely what cause visibility in our industry. But I know we're coming up on time, but I guess the question that Nabeel started to ask that I interrupted earlier was, what's next for Rich Miller? I assume you will finally take on your passion of marine biology.
Fishing.
Yeah.
I'm actually starting to explore hobbies, which I haven't done in many, many years. The most important thing is I'm spending more time with my family. My dad's 94. I really want to spend time with him and decompress a little bit. This whole sort of, 7 to 10 year speed run of going from startup through acquisition is a burnout's a real thing. But so I'm sort of enjoying having a little bit of downtime. I'm still keeping track of what's happening in the industry because I'm fascinated by it. And LinkedIn is a great venue to be able to both stay current on what everybody's doing in the industry and kind of chip in and share some thoughts on what's going on there. But I'm going to take some downtime and see, what makes sense going forward. I took up photography, and so I'm trying to get out and enjoy the beautiful fall foliage in the areas where we live, both here in Central Jersey, and we spend time up in the Poconos, and really
right in between those two places is a lovely town named Montclair. So feel free to stop by and say hello.
I was thinking more around the lines. It's going to fall under photojournalism now. There's a new app for that.
I've always taken pictures. People were much more welcoming back in the old days when you said, hey, I want to come to your data center and take photos in the non-sensitive places and help people understand what's going on. That's a hard lift nowadays. People don't want to let a journalist in a data center with a camera so much. But I've always taken pictures, done photography and videography. But, just as like a journalist who's doing it as like a secondary piece of the job, a lot of journalists nowadays who are working remote and are, not in a centralized newsroom anymore are learning a lot of these skills. But it's kind of fun to just step back and take a look at the beauty of nature around you and really try to capture some of that. And that's a big part of what I'm doing. But mostly it's spending time with family. With Colleen, after having multiple careers, she's now a full-time artist, and I'm trying to support her in that and enjoy her work there. My kids both still live in New Jersey. They're both working in the IT field, and they are impressive young men, and I'm really enjoying spending time with them as well. So I am keeping busy. I honestly don't know what the next adventure is going to be. But what I know is this industry is ascendant in a way that never has been. It's central to so much that goes on in the economy, in society, in business. And AI has really just sort of ramped all of this up to another level. So, there's going to be lots to follow and for somebody to write about onto the horizon.
I think what we should all do is not let our guards down, because even in retirement, Rich Miller will be watching.
Absolutely. So, Rich, for starters, thank you very much for your service, for what you have done for the sector in simplifying and demystifying technology for the masses. Knowing what you know today and through your journey, if you were to narrow it down to one message for people that are not from the space and how big the opportunity is and the potential that it brings forth, what would you tell them?
Technology is fascinating, and data centers are a particularly fascinating part of it that drive the digital economy, that so much of our world and the technologies, and whether it's entertainment or education, so many of the things that are really absorbing people nowadays originate in the data center. It is where much of the, it's hard to say, hey, this is where the excitement comes from. But that's really a big part of the story, and helping folks to understand both the impact of data centers and what fascinating environments they are. I think that's an important message that maybe not enough folks know yet. And I think we're all going to have to do a good job continuing to try and explain that. And Nabeel, you and Phil have done such a great job in seeking to advance that and being early adopters of that.
Rich, thank you very much for taking the time. This has been lovely. I'm glad we were actually finally able to get you on the platform. And thank you again for everything that you've done.
We interviewed the interviewer. We finally interviewed the interviewer.
Exactly. Well, we didn't get asked any questions, Phil, so we did it.
We might have to ask Rich to write this one up.
This has been a blast. I really appreciate the invite. I know, Phil, you've been bugging me for years about this. And so it's been really fun to finally get together and make it happen.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Rich.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on the Nomad Futurist Podcast. Remember, technology, markets, and challenges will continue to evolve, but those who adapt and prepare are the ones who will thrive. Embrace the change, stay curious, and let's build a future worth moving towards. The journey has just begun, and we're glad you're here with us. Visit us anytime at media.nomadfuturist.org to stay connected and be a part of the movement. Until next time, keep exploring.